So I'm going to present the central parts of a longish paper I'm writing for Law and History journal. So it's basically a social and political history of labor legislation in the United States during the long Gilded Age and especially the interwar years, the New Deal period. There's a lot of context about the labor question, the rise of labor conflicts, especially during the revolt of the laborers after 1909, attempts to resolve these conflicts with solutions such as the protocols of peace. I have to skip all of that. The point in the paper is to situate Robert Wagner in his context and to understand his reform project this way. A major part of the paper deals with the rise of a cross-class labor progressive alliance involving Wagner and other reformers with organized labor to push for reforms to resolve the main issues of the day, especially to bring down the regime of government by injunction of labor relations. So I'm going to do something weird here. I'm going to go to the text and basically give me a second. The main victory of the AFL and the reformers, progressive reformers, before the New Deal was the passage in 1932 of the Norris-LaGuardia Act. And that opened a moment of collective laissez-faire in labor relations that was very different from the oppression under which organized labor had to live under the Lochner Constitution. So some of the key actors here were AFL constitutionalists, such as Andrew Furuseth or John Frey, who basically made an argument, a constitutional argument to restrict court injunctions and basically obtain from Congress laws that would protect workers' ability to combine, to negotiate genuine contracts and exercise what they called actual liberty of contract. Frey wrote that the court's disregard for essential human rights, what he called industrial liberty, and the court's enforcement of class distinctions and class privileges had to be stopped. And basically, the AFL rooted its argument for basic protections in the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, essentially. If the AFL had its way, the Norris-LaGuardia Act would have stated that every human being, every worker, has a right to the disposal of his labor free from interference, restraint, or coercion by employers. And they also have the right to associate with other human beings for the protection and advancement of their common interests. This is language that we'll find in part in the Wagner Act. The basic argument that progressives and organized labor were making back then is that collective bargaining is the way to achieve actual liberty of contract. And basically, Wagner and other reformers were arguing that public policy had to stand in favor of labor's full freedom of association. And there were already gains being made at this level in 32. The core of the paper is basically dealing with the development of what has been called the New Deal collective bargaining policy and how it developed over the years. Essentially, we're talking about a program of administrative intervention and institution building, as authors have said, which starts with Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which Wagner managed to put in there. And it culminates with the passage of the Wagner Act in 35. What's important to understand this development in public policy is, first of all, the severity of the Great Depression. I'm not going to go into this, but that was the profound the dramatic and profound change in American institution developed from there. Second point that was important was the fact that reformers such as Wagner, and they were numerous, explained the Depression in large part by the instability of consumer demand, were 10 years before Keynes, and they attributed the instability of consumer demand on the maldistribution of income and the lack of purchasing power on the part of workers. And third, reformers argued and developed a case that a key role in recovery policies needed to be given to a closer coordination of production and income distribution. And in that context, they said that the best tool would be to encourage collective bargaining. So basically, the Great Depression brought forth an economic rationale for collective bargaining. We see it in the preamble of the Wagner Act, where it's written that in the absence of collective bargaining, there are recurrent business depression, the wage rates are depressed, and the purchasing of power of wage earners prevents stabilization. So this is just the broadest context. The Wagner Act and the path to the Wagner Act was very contested. There were different policymaking constituencies that we need to take into account. The first group is that of legal realists, such as Felix Frankfurter, who basically wrote the Norris-LaGuardia Act. I'm not going to dwell in their work here, but their perspective was slightly different from Wagner's. The second constituency was organized labor, and it lobbied really hard for the Wagner Act. There were not much divisions to start with on this front. Political scientist David Plotke has argued that the passage of the Wagner Act was primarily the result of initiatives taken by progressive liberals, such as Wagner, but they were in alliance with the labor movement. And what I really show in the paper is that this alliance was long-standing and it was really tight. The Wagner Act was written by a group of lawyers, including attorneys from the AFL. The third constituency was, of course, business, and the business opposition to the Wagner Act was more unified than any other single piece of New Deal legislation. It was unified, it was aggressive. Organized business attacks Wagner's bills relentlessly and resists their implementation. And basically, we can argue, following Kim Phillips Fine, that organized business and business conservatives were had an antipathy towards social democracy, and they feared the social democratic effects of the Wagner Act, and that's why they resisted so strongly. The last group, and I'm going to focus on them for the rest of the discussion here. The fourth group is the key group, is that of policymakers and drafters that were closely associated with Senator Wagner. I'm talking here mostly about the lawyer and political economist who actually wrote the act. It's Wagner's legislative aide, William Hirsch Kesseling. There were allied senators, Robert La Follette, Albert Thomas. They helped the implementation of the act by launching a multi-year investigation in violations of the rights to free speech and freedom of association, the La Follette Committee. I might come back to that a bit later. And especially there was a cohort of New Deal officials and National Labor Relations Board officials, such as Francis Biddle, Eber Blankenhorn, Thomas Emerson, David Cepos. They were all intimately involved in the drafting of the Wagner Act and then its implementation. I'm going to move forward a bit here to just the key point, why social democracy is in the title. What I found in my research over the recent years is not only that organized labor called Wagner R. Bob. He was a close ally since at least 1913. So there was a progressive labor coalition that looks a bit like what we find in social democracies. but also Wagner's solution for the problems he had encountered under Lochner laissez-faire doctrine was to basically argue for unprecedented amount of planning at the national level in the US compared to what had been seen historically. Also, there's something that needs to be developed by further research, but there was a direct influence of experiences in Germany in particular. Wagner traveled often there and was well aware of the labor relations of the Weimar Republic, for instance. I'm trying to get at the intent of these New Deal lawyers. I'm saying the Wagner Act was written by a group of tightly knit lawyers and officials. They conceived the Wagner Act as the cornerstone to achieve economic justice. It was not just a labor relations measure. For them, it was related to social reform in its broadest sense. They were men who drafted the Wagner Act, were long-term progressive reformers. They were firm legal realists. Kesseling had been trained in critical realist labor law scholarship. They were also students of progressive social science. They had a very critical perspective on the laissez-faire state and liberty of contract doctrines. They wanted to replace that by a welfare state that would be developed from positive entitlements for workers in terms of organization and solidarity. So for them, and I'm citing here legal scholar, it's Cassebert, who has made several interviews with Kesseling. Basically, what they wanted to do, according to Cassebert, was to write social democracy into the so-called private relations of production. It was to create a mini civil society on a social democratic model. So this goes way beyond just simply the right to organize and strike. It's a new way to regulate the economy. Kesseling, who wrote the various drafts of the Wagner Act, was involved in many reforms alongside Wagner. He was actually the writer of Roosevelt's plank and basically the platform committee of 36, 40, and 44. Many of the words we attribute to Wagner, for instance, the Second Bill of Rights, that was actually Wagner and Kesseling writing it. So all the discussion around economic and industrial democracy, social justice, the attacks on economic royalists who didn't basically respect the Wagner Act once it was passed, we can bring that back to Kesseling and Wagner's actions. They had a single target, according to Kesseling himself. It was really to attack employer violations of labor's right to organize and bargain collectively. Many have tried to construe the Wagner Act as trying to channel radical labor into more reformist orientations. It was way more a way to constrain employers who were systematically violating existing rights. So basically, the Wagner Act is best understood. I'm citing Larry Gerber here. It's stemming from the conclusion that was drawn by Wagner and other intellectuals that without collective bargaining, the American economy might never recover from the Depression, but also that without effective state intervention, American employers would continue effectively to resist unionization. So that was their key orientation. Wagner knew, as he was the first National Labor Relations Board chairman, he knew that the refusal of employers to deal with properly chosen representatives of workers accounted to more than 70% of the work of the National Labor Relations Board. And that resistance didn't stop once the Wagner Act was passed. So Wagner wanted to improve and increase the powers of the National Labor Relations Board, having been really frustrated between 33 and 35. He sought counsel from the existing union movement. He also sought counsel from legal realist scholars who basically argued that individually workers have no possibility to be in free competition with concentrated capital. And we see Wagner make this argument quite clearly in Congress. And it's written in the first labor relations bill. It's written that there's a tendency in modern life towards integration and centralized control, the rise of, I'm supposed to be done here, finish in a couple of minutes. Basically, the argument was that with concentrated capital, huge corporations, there was a destruction of the balance of bargaining power between the individual worker and the corporation. And this is what they wanted to address, basically. And finally, this is the core piece, the core argument in the paper. New Deal lawyers went back to long-standing progressive arguments, arching back to Brandeis's arguments in favor of industrial democracy in the era of World War I. And basically, the core argument was that the constitutional protections of life, liberty, and property needed to be reinterpreted in light of the demands of social justice and of democracy. And this is the point of view that Wagner adopted when he attacked the Loechnerian regime as, I quote, perpetuating in modern industry aspects of the old feudal master-servant relationship. Basically, Wagner argued that workers were working under a regime of despotism in the workplace, and it needed to be replaced by a regime of democratic self-government. I'm going to sum up here what follows in the paper real quick. The law circumscribed the power of employers to use their property as they preferred. And that was their core argument in attacking the Wagner Act. They attacked the Wagner Act as basically a way to create a labor trust or a labor monopoly. This is the argument made in Congress. But there was also the good old argument that's being used these days to attack the Wagner Act in court, made by James Emery of the National Association of Manufacturers. And he basically argued that the Wagner Act was infringing upon the most fundamental right, that is the right to contract and refuse to contract, the right to decline to associate with others. And this is the basis for relentless attacks on the Wagner Bill, the Wagner Act, from business conservatives. And in the paper, I'm finishing on this, in the paper I document how several business conservatives and business associations were the basis of a conservative coalition with Southern Democrats and Republicans, how they sought to attack the National Labor Relations Board and weaken it, and how they pushed for reforms that led to the Taft-Hartley Act of 47 and 230 odd other bills that sought to basically reverse the policy direction of the Wagner Act. So I'm going to stop here for today, and I thank you for